know what they say. Fool me once, strike one. But fool me twice, strike three.
Back in 2011, I remember watching the first episode of Game of Thrones and being overwhelmed when the royal party shows up at Winterfell. The horses, the castle, the armor. My friends were talking about the Hound's helmet for the next week. By the second season, watch parties were the norm. We'd pile into a friend's house who had HBO, gossip and theorize and speculate about what might happen next. As someone who had read the books and was even a contributor to the A Song of Ice and Fire wiki before the show aired, my friends looked to me for context and answers.
I read about it in a book.
I wasn't quite one of the 7 new gods of Westeros, but I was close.
I find that hard to believe.
Not since The Lord of the Rings had we seen a fantasy story so faithfully captured on screen. The characters were distinct, nuanced and compelling, the acting was impeccable, the world rich and broad and complex. Game of Thrones was part of a wave that made being a nerd cool again. It broke viewership records, piracy records. Critics and audiences loved it. It won more Emmys than any drama in TV history. It permeated the culture.
We've got 3 huge Game of Thrones fans here ready to answer some trivia. You guys ready?
Sure. Game of Thrones!
People were giving their children Dothraki names. But just as the show was moving into its final seasons and audience attention was reaching a crescendo, it all fell apart.
A day will come when you think you're safe and happy, and your joy will turn to ashes in your mouth.
The backlash to the show's final season was historic. YouTuber and author Lindsay Ellis said it best.
So, the internet has lost its mind.
When seeking to lay blame for the series' downfall, some pointed to the fact that the last 2 books in the Song of Ice and Fire series were unfinished. The show's writers ran out of source material and were left scrambling, leading to things not really making sense.
We watch all of the Dothraki die, but then they're fine. Grey Worm seems to be making a huge decision to sacrifice the Unsullied, but then there's an endless number of them. Scorpion bolts have pinpoint accuracy until they don't. The Red Keep looks like it's collapsing in on itself, except no it doesn't.
But the main complaint people rallied around was that despite the actors and the network being open to continuing the show well past the 8th season, the showrunners didn't choose to take the time needed to finish the story faithfully.
Why is it ending?
I don't know. Ask David and Dan when they come through. We could have gone to 11, 12, 13 seasons, but I guess they wanted a life.
Over 1.7 million people signed a petition demanding HBO remake the final season, only to have HBO come back and say, not a chance.
It's done, Cess.
No.
You cannot stop it.
In the following years, I can't count the number of times I've been amongst friends or at a party only to have the conversation devolve into a discussion of the ending of Game of Thrones.
It's fun. Look at the fun we're having.
In 2022, House of the Dragon, a prequel set 200 years before the original, aired. If anyone was this show's target audience, it was me. I had a coaster set of the great houses adorned with their house words. I had the Game of Thrones coffee table book before I owned a coffee table, but I couldn't watch it. I felt like Westeros was dead to me.
Don't look so grim. It's all just a game.
But the reviews came out and, hey, they were good. The hype wasn't what it was for Game of Thrones, but it was there. Unlike the original series, this source material is done. We aren't at risk of suffering from one of the major issues to blame for Game of Thrones' downfall. But man, the ending to the original series hurts.
How can a man be brave if he's afraid? That is the only time a man can be brave, he told me.
Okay, sure, but do we really want to...
I demand a trial by combat.
Okay, fine, let's go! Ba, 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 ba. Avoid copyright, avoid copyright, avoid copyright. Ba, 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 ba. After some voiceover to set things up, the show opens with a ride through King's Landing on Dragonback. And wow, does our old stomping ground ever look good? Adjusted for inflation, the budget of the first few seasons of Game of Thrones was $10 million per episode. House of the Dragon doubles that. So of course, the prequel has helmets too. It also has darkness. So much darkness. This is you better have blackout curtains dark. It's like they watched the fight scenes against the White Walker horde in Game of Thrones and said, everyone's talking about how dark it is. They must love it. I think that $10 million an episode difference was spent on candles. But dark doesn't just describe the lighting in the first season of House of the Dragon. It fits the overall tone. When laughter hits, it's usually at someone's expense. Bitter and cold, dry, sarcastic, and defeatist. There's also just far fewer jokes, quips, and witty retorts than there were in Game of Thrones. In some ways, the dark tone is a tremendous feat in filmmaking. The somber atmosphere of the first season of House of the Dragon permeates every element of the show. The prequel's showrunners promised more war and more humor in the second season. And they kind of followed through until...
I need you to fly with Dreamfire to battle.
Aemond.
I do not wish to fight.
Wait, that's the end? What the? There is also more of a focus on female characters in House of the Dragon. These female characters are moving the plot forward. They're driving scenes, and most of all, they're dragon riders. But with the shift in focus, the show is not exactly celebratory. 4 separate episodes in the first season include birth scenes, traumatic ones.
It's not a pleasant story.
Game of Thrones got a lot of flack for gratuitous sex scenes and its inclusion of sexual violence. House of the Dragon has much less of this, but there are still elements of it in the show. Another major difference between the shows is pacing. The most obvious example of this is the time jumps. It can be disorienting to skip years and change actors, which makes it all the more impressive that House of the Dragon somehow pulls it off. Despite the large gaps in time, I found it easy to care about these characters.
I raise my cup to you and to your house.
The early seasons of Game of Thrones were great with theme.
Knowledge is power.
Seize him. Power is power.
House of the Dragon is trying to tell us something too. About legacy, about life, about parenthood. It's about the burdens of women and mortality and the roles we are born into.
What is this brief mortal life? If not the pursuit of legacy.
Legacy may be why you live your life, Corlys.
But there is one area in which House of the Dragon clearly surpasses Game of Thrones. One element that changes my recommendation from a tepid endorsement to a must-watch.
Do you know what happened?
Dragons?
Yes. Dragons happened.
When Game of Thrones was airing, there was a common complaint of not enough dragons.
Where are my dragons?
Jokes about the show's lacking CGI budget were a regular thing. House of the Dragon is a flying, roaring, screeching, fire-breathing, soldier-stomping monster show. The dragons aren't just set pieces. They're woven into the story. They're used to explore theme, to disrupt and challenge systems of power. Game of Thrones didn't have as many dragons, but it did have a lot more range. The first season was part mystery, a whodunit, with Ned as our Sherlock.
What sort of doom does the king face? The same sort as John Arryn.
Both series have elements of horror, but Game of Thrones has some truly creepy scenes.
He's not here.
It's not so much that the two shows don't overlap. It's more that Game of Thrones' circle is just bigger. Part of this has to do with the genre and format of the source material. Game of Thrones is epic fantasy, told from the perspective of the characters living through fantastic times. Fire and Blood is more of a history, written down by a maester of the Citadel, this guy. Fire and Blood is basically a series of notable events. Deaths and births and wars and high crimes. The book isn't just a list of names and dates. It has stories and the occasional quote, but it doesn't reach the level of immersion or depth as A Song of Ice and Fire. Part of this is just because of the length. A Song of Ice and Fire is 5 books long, spanning 1.7 million words and 4,200 pages so far. House of the Dragon is based on 300 pages from one book, which is part of the reason I think Game of Thrones feels like there's a lot more going on. There's just so much more content to shove into those seasons. In the first season of Game of Thrones, you go on tours of the North, the Wall, Beyond the Wall, the Eyrie, Essos, and the Red Waste. In the first season of House of the Dragon, you're in King's Landing and Storm's End. Specifically, on this bridge. You're in the steppe zones, but specifically this cove. You're in Essos, but again, this castle. And don't even get me started on Driftmark and this dock in Season 2. It feels like this boat has been under repair for 2 time jumps. Oh, wow, we're leaving. We're going somewhere else. Oh, never mind. In the second season of Game of Thrones, we get Stannis and Davos and the Lord of Light.
For the night is dark and full of terrors.
We get the Iron Islands and paying the iron price. There aren't just 2 or 3 people competing for the throne, but 3, 4...
Another king? How many is that now? 5? I've lost count.
And don't forget about the aspiring queen.
Not a queen. A Khaleesi.
In the second season of House of the Dragon, there is an opening scene in the north, few largely inconsequential scenes in the Eyrie, and some battles throughout Westeros. And finally, in the last episode, another trip to Essos. In both shows, a significant portion of the second season takes place in Harrenhal. The breadth of characters is another way the 2 shows differ.
I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples, bastards, and broken things.
You can't beat Tyrion. You just can't. He's one of the best characters of all time. He has humor and wit and guile. He is brave and kind and seems capable of bringing order to chaos.
Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on the wall, and a very small man can cast a very large shadow.
Tywin is such a great character, wonderfully portrayed, with so much depth and nuance. We hate him, but we respect him. People loathe Joffrey. And Cersei. Syrio Forel taught us to dance. He also taught us...
What do we say to the god of death?
Not today.
Ned Stark stole all our hearts and fulfilled the Sean Bean curse.
I learned how to die a long time ago.
There's Samwell Tarly and Brienne of Tarth. There's Shay, Littlefinger, Varys. These are minor characters, but they made a major impact. Remember Roose Bolton?
In my family we say, a naked man has few secrets, a flayed man none.
I'm just saying, the bench is deep. And these are just a few characters from the first 2 seasons. We haven't even touched on some of the best characters that come in later in the series. It's worth noting that not all of this genius is from the source material. Littlefinger's Chaos is a Ladder speech was apparently invented for the show. Tywin skinning the stag was not in the books either, and I love that scene. But the writers in House of the Dragon have had to come up with a lot more on their own. There is little dialogue in Fire and Blood, few actual scenes. Most of what you're seeing on the screen in House of the Dragon is original to the show.
The path I walk has never been trod.
So it's commendable that House of the Dragon does have such great characters. Viserys' character felt so real to me, paired with some of the best acting I've ever seen. And how cool is the Lord of the Tides?
To elude a storm, you can either sail into it or around it. But you must never await its coming.
Daemon is undeniably enjoyable. He's a stubborn character, certainly not a hero. But people seem to like him. What exactly is a zaddy? Oh, this. There's Otto Hightower and Aegon.
I wish to spill blood, not ink.
There's also some fairly memorable side characters.
The rat catchers!
And who doesn't love some lighthearted twin shenanigans?
We were born together. You parted us! Forgive me.
No! No!
Princess Rhaenys might be the hardest not to like. And of course, Rhaenyra. What a performance. And I'm not just saying that because my fiance really likes Emma Darcy.
What's your drink of choice?
A Negroni.
I was going to say the same thing.
Magliato. With Prosecco in it.
Oh, stunning.
House of the Dragon, the characters feel a bit less fantasy to me, apart from this guy. A bit more literary in some ways. But despite this, Game of Thrones manages to feel more full, more real. In Game of Thrones, the settings are almost characters in themselves. We learn about other religions, cultures, and traditions. With the exception of Harrenhal, the settings in House of the Dragon are more venues for the historical events to happen. Up until the final episode of Season 2, where it felt like we got more culture than the first 2 seasons combined. So when it comes to setting and characters, I just gotta give this one to Game of Thrones. That monkey was sick, though. I mean, look at him. Alright, let's talk about where this might really fall apart. People didn't know what would happen in Game of Thrones. Even people who had read the books. There were theories. Oh, there were theories.
The next time we see each other, we'll talk about your mother.
While evil often seemed to have the upper hand, there was usually reason to hope.
Someone who can rule and should rule. Centuries come and go without a person like that coming into the world.
House of the Dragon is a prequel. It takes place before Game of Thrones. And if you've seen the original show, you know that no matter what happens in House of the Dragon, Westeros won't end up with a democracy. Sexism will still be rampant, women will not rule, and the lives of the small folk will still be subject to the whims and ambitions of powerful lords.
They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
Even after Game of Thrones, despite all of Daenerys' claims and aspirations,
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
the wheel will keep on spinning. Only now in a surveillance state. This makes it hard to have hope for the progressive efforts in House of the Dragon. We know they don't succeed, well, at least not long term. Another thing I found hard to buy into was House of the Dragon's intent on cashing in on our love for Game of Thrones and the battle between the humans and the White Walkers. The show starts off with this clumsy inclusion of A Song of Ice and Fire as Aegon's dream.
It was a dream. And just as Daenerys foresaw the end of Valyria, Aegon foresaw the end of the world of men. Just to begin with a terrible winter.
It's worth noting that this dream is not mentioned in A Song of Ice and Fire, or Fire and Blood. Its inclusion even seems to conflict with the original show, where Sam implies he came up with the title himself.
What's this?
A Song of Ice and Fire. Archmaester Ebro's history of the wars following the death of King Robert. I helped him with the title.
The dagger is also not mentioned in Fire and Blood. The dream and the dagger seem to be held up as symbols that what happens in House of the Dragon matters. That we need the right people to win for the dagger to end up in the right hands. Arya's, for some reason? I'm not really buying that correlation. If Aegon's dream is so important, which again, it doesn't exist in the books, why is it kept a secret? Why didn't the Targaryens make the prophecy part of the land's religion? It's mentioned several times that the small folk see the dragons as gods. They could have gotten the whole realm to buy in, made sure they reunited, ready for that surge. If the dagger is so important, put it behind glass with a label that says break in case of Night King. And remember, we didn't like the original ending. This show should try to stand on its own. Still, knives and dreams probably aren't going to destroy a whole series. Probably.
The prince that was promised.
I don't understand this house.
But characters can. The real problem with the ending of Game of Thrones was that after 5 seasons of taking the time to build these incredible character arcs, the characters suddenly did a bunch of stuff that felt contrived and illogical. Their actions were wrong for who we had learned these characters had become. The pacing felt off, and there just weren't enough episodes. So alarm bells start going off when Rhaenyra is suddenly talking about killing a bunch of innocents.
The strongholds of the usurper, Old Town and Lannisport and their armies, all must be subdued.
You wish for us to kill innocents?
And so many.
Why are we killing a bunch of innocents? War crimes are not the only answer here.
It is hard, but it cannot be helped.
Rhaenyra's whole character has been trying to avoid war, and now she's going from 0 to 100 and killing innocents. This sounds very familiar. Remember, people didn't like that. It was also just bad storytelling. It's also hard not to get worried when the queens start to effectively fast travel, similar to what happened in the final seasons of Game of Thrones, which caught so much flack from viewers. And the show went from 10 episodes in season 1 to 8 in season 2, which again reminds us of the original show, and not in a good way. They're also not making the most of their time they do have. Daemon spends 3 episodes hallucinating, and then he meets this little lord who kind of puts him in his place, but in the end, it seems the only thing that really affected him was his dream, where he was basically shown the future, again, weakly tying it to the original show. It feels like those 3 episodes spent hallucinating were a waste of time, doesn't it? You can give the show leeway here, give grace, but we were asked to give a lot of grace in the seasons leading up to the finale of Game of Thrones, and look what that got us. The lack of logic kills immersion. Contrivances kill immersion. To achieve the initial success that Game of Thrones had, House of the Dragon needs to stick with what makes sense. The Red Wedding was shocking because of the death of the main characters, but what made it powerful was that it fit, both for the characters and the world. We knew Lord Bolton was sus. We knew Walder Frey was sus.
I have known Lord Walder since I was a girl. He would never harm me.
Unless there was a prophet in it.
Rob was young and stressed and overburdened. He wanted to do the noble thing with his new love. It added up to tragedy, but it all added up. Ned Stark's death is another great example here. We wanted Ned to live, but looking back, it's obvious that a man so committed to doing what is right and who fails to recognize and adapt to the scheming around him just couldn't survive in this world.
I did warn you not to trust me.
These tragedies added to the immersion of the show. They didn't reduce it. There will no doubt be more tragedy in House of the Dragon. If they want to avoid a repeat of the ending of Game of Thrones and making us feel the fool, they need to focus on what makes sense for the characters and for the world. They need to take the time and allow the characters to earn their endings.
So what was the fucking point in all this then?
It's a difficult task to compete with Game of Thrones, but with great casting, acting, and solid writing, and some truly awesome dragon scenes, House of the Dragon is certainly in the fight. Considering Game of Thrones' botched ending, House of the Dragon might even come out on top. So I'm going to keep watching. But it's also worth noting that there are 7 Game of Thrones spin-offs in the works. There's a lot on the line here. Not just for me, trying to protect my shrunken, fragile heart. For George R.R. Martin, for HBO, for fantasy as a whole. I'm giving the A Song of Ice and Fire cinematic universe another shot, but we're on thin ice here. I believe Jurassic Park is one of the best movies ever made. I've also read the book by Michael Crichton, and I loved it. The dinosaurs in the newer Jurassic Park movies are bigger, they're more realistic, and the CGI is great. But I've given up on the franchise until I see some evidence they're taking the storytelling seriously. So House of the Dragon, please take this seriously, because...
There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, fool me once, shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.